I think it's something that the government in Saskatchewan and our federal government will be watching carefully, and Cameco and Areva. Now, as I read the probe that has been launched by the U.S., that some are saying might be the thing that comes before a move on tariffs. The federal government in the United States, the U.S. government, seems to be responding to American uranium companies that are concerned about state-owned enterprises, principally in Kazakhstan and Russia. So that's not so bad necessarily, but these probes can take any direction. I mean, that's how the aluminum steel tariffs began. They began as a probe of the U.S. government, and then they evolved into the tariffs that have precipitated a bit of a back and forth that's not very good for either side. So I think they'll be looking very carefully at it. Overall, I think there's some signs of strengthening in the uranium sector, which has been under a lot of pressure for a long time, since Fukushima, really. I think in May, Japan restarted their 8th reactor. I know that our government in Saskatchewan worked with the Harper government to open up India and China to Saskatchewan uranium, to Canadian uranium. And so more work can be done there, but I obviously this is not welcome news, and who knows where that probe could lead. But right now it looks like it's focused on the American companies are complaining, if you will, about uranium coming from state SOEs in Kazakhstan and some in Russia.
Although, of course, as you know, the Prime Minister has said it's absurd taxing Canadian steel and aluminum on security grounds. It would seem odd to tax Canadian uranium on security grounds, but this White House is unpredictable.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I don't know how anyone could possibly make the national security case around aluminum and steel, and yet they did. And this is uranium, which has got other sensitivities, so maybe they think it's a clearer shot for them, the U.S. side. But it's important to remember that I think over 90% or right around that number is the uranium that they have to import.
Oh, yes, at least, yeah.
So in that scale, in terms of that quantum, the uranium coming in from SOEs from places like Russia and Kazakhstan, you would think would be a target before Canadian uranium, as you point out.
Move on to Trans Mountain, if we could. The federal government is trying to find somebody to come in and partner with it, possibly sell off the pipeline. What are you hearing? Are they making progress?
I haven't heard of progress. I've heard of the effort being made, certainly. So, I mean, credit the federal government for that. I think Minister Morneau is following up on his commitment to try to make sure taxpayers are not in the pipeline business long term. And so I hope they're successful. Taxpayers should hope they're successful. I have said publicly, I'm not sure we ever needed to get here. I was hoping our federal government might beat BC to the court, get a reference from the Supreme Court, and that probably would enable the project to go ahead as a private sector sponsored project, as it should be. But having said that, we're all hoping the federal government finds a buyer. More importantly, we haven't seen a lot of signs that the construction is actually going to move ahead, that the pipeline's moving ahead. And I think there's increasing concern out west about that this needs to be more than just an announcement by the federal government responding to Kinder Morgan's May 31st deadline. We need to see some action. We do hope, obviously, we see the devolution of the taxpayers' interest in it to somebody in the private sector or some group.
And the latest deadline, July 22nd from
right.
Kinder Morgan, yeah. Would you like to see Saskatchewan invest in the pipeline? Premier Notley of Alberta has raised that idea for her province.
Well, I hope that provinces are very circumspect and cautious about making that sort of an investment. You know, that is a pretty good business. Kinder Morgan has a good operation. Pipelines are, I guess, a pretty reasonable investment to make. However, it's my observation that when governments pick winners and losers and use taxpayers as involuntary venture capitalists, they're only half right usually, and it ain't the good half for the most part.
The cabinet shuffle, Amarjeet Sohi is coming in.
Right.
He's an Albertan coming in as Natural Resources Minister, replacing Jim Carr. Jim Carr moving to another portfolio. Were you happy with Jim Carr's performance as Natural Resources Minister?
Well, in short, I would say no. No, I think there was some left on the table there. The fact that the only way we've got a pipeline moving forward, the one we just talked about, is that the government had to go full Venezuela to get it done. We backed away from Gateway and the Energy East piece. I think we needed a natural resources minister and need one still at the table. For example, we needed one on the Energy East situation where the NEB rule changes were made midstream of the project to require now that upstream and downstream emissions be factored into the approval process. It happened in the middle of a project that already had headwinds, and notwithstanding what's been said publicly, I think it's fair to say that those changes caused that pipeline to be shelved. That's a huge loss to the country. It's a loss to my province, and I just think if you consider where the state of our natural resource sector, the amount of investment that's moved from our energy sector to the U.S. energy sector, the investment that's been lost, part of that I think is the responsibility of the Natural Resources Minister. So we're hopeful. I'm hopeful. We have a minister from the province of Alberta. Our former government, I guess my former government, I think had a positive experience. We don't get everything we want when you deal with an infrastructure minister federally, but I think the minister was earnest and engaged. That was our experience, my experience. So I'm hoping he brings that and a Alberta sensibility, a positive natural resource sensibility to the file.
And just finally, you as Premier were adamantly opposed to the carbon pricing that the federal government threatened to impose. Doug Ford, the new Premier of Ontario, shares those views. So Saskatchewan now has a powerful ally in the fight against the federal government's carbon plan.
A very powerful ally in Premier Ford's, and he's moved early on that promise with respect to pricing carbon, or cap and trade, or a carbon tax. And then last week, Prince Edward Island joined in terms of their commitment to fight against a federally imposed carbon tax. That's significant. And whereas at my last Premier's meeting at Edmonton last summer, maybe the Saskatchewan delegation was a little lonely, this year I think Premier Moe has got strong allies, and I think other premiers are starting to ask the question, is this the right approach? No one's doubting that Canada needs to be a part of the fight against climate change, but we're wondering if a myopic focus on our 1.9% of global emissions in the name of pricing it, or a carbon tax, is that the best way to do it? Or should we be focused on technological solutions that are actually going to be applicable around the world? A world, by the way, where 1,500 coal plants are being built.